Hello, this is Mrs. Housley, and this is a video tutorial that could help you prepare for an upcoming test or just help you with your homework. If you look here, you're going to see a number 3. If you don't have it yet, I'm going to have you go ahead and pause the video. You need to find Unit 5, Exercise 3. That's going to be on page 57 of your grammar packet. Go ahead and pause and find that if you don't have it already. Now, I'm choosing to show you number 3 because it has a pretty involved diagram, and I want to focus on that one just so that you know how to diagram something with multiple parts. The very first thing I'm going to do, just like we've always done, is go through and label the parts of speech. Remember the order of units that we've done. We want to go in that order because it makes logical sense and it also keeps you from making a mistake. So the first thing we're going to do is locate all of the nouns. This says, against the laws of her city, Mrs. Parks is a proper noun. And I'm going to draw these wings here because it's a proper noun with more than one word. Mrs. Parks simply sat in a whites-only section of a city bus. So we have several common nouns here and then the proper noun Mrs. Parks because it's talking about a specific person. The next step is to label articles and adjectives. So I'm going to go in, I see this word, the. Then whose city? Her city. I have the article a here. And then whites only, those quotations, that means that's a direct quotation from a specific sign. And so you're going to view those two words as one unit. So whites only actually works together as an adjective to modify section. It tells what kind of section. Again, I'm going to draw the wings because it is an adjective that encompasses more than one word. Then I have this article A, and then city tells what kind of bus, a city bus. Now, the next thing I would do would be to move to Unit 2. Remember, we looked for pronouns. Even though I do have a pronoun here, that pronoun her, we actually label it as an adjective because it's functioning as an adjective. It's telling me whose city, her city. So if we look here, we really don't have any pronouns that are acting as pronouns. So now we're going to move to prepositional phrases. Remember, we find the preposition and then we double check to see if it has a noun or pronoun as the object. My first one here I see against, and I ask against what? Against the laws. Then we have of what? Of her city. Then we have in a what? In a whites only section. And of what? Of a city bus. The next thing we did was to identify the subject and the verb. That was Unit 4. Remember that sometimes we'll have a word that looks like a verb, but if it doesn't have a subject, it's not acting as an action verb. So to double check that, we're just going to go to any words that look like verbs, and we're going to start by putting a V above them. Here I have the word sat, which I know can be an action, so I'm going to check and see if it has a subject. I'm going to do that by asking who or what sat. Here I can look and I can say that Mrs. Parks sat. Because I have a subject for that verb, I know it is an action verb. I've also identified the subject, Mrs. Parks, and the verb sat, which will be the first two things that go on my diagram. Finally, I'm going to move on to adverbs, and I see this ly word here. Now, remember that not all ly words are adverbs. only if the ly is being used as a suffix, and the root word would originally have been an adjective. So I'm going to look at this word simply. The root is simple, and simple is an adjective. When I add the ly suffix, it makes it an adverb. Now, if it's an adverb, it's going to modify a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. Here, simply, Mrs. Parks simply sat. It tells how she sat. She simply sat. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to draw an arrow over to the word sat. Now, the directions, if you look at the top of exercise 3, the directions don't tell you that you have to do that, but I do it because it prevents me from making an error when I'm moving to my diagram. I'm going to go through all of my modifiers and draw those arrows. So I see now that prepositional phrase, I know that prepositional phrases also modify. So I'm going to start with against the laws. Now, Mrs. Parks, which Mrs. Parks? Mrs. Parks against the laws? That doesn't really sound right. So I know that that preposition does not modify the subject Mrs. Parks. Now I'm going to ask, did she sit against the laws? And she did. She sat in protest against them. So the prepositional phrase against the laws does modify the verb sat. Next, I'm going to look at of her city. The preposition of makes it very easy to find the modifier because of usually links to the noun that comes right before it. Here that's also true. If I said, what laws, then I could answer with the laws of her city. The prepositional phrase of her city answers the question, what laws? So I know that it modifies this noun, which is acting as the object of the preposition in the prepositional phrase right before it. Now I'm going to go down to in a whites only section. Now, in a whites only section, modifies where Rosa Parks sat. She sat where? In a whites only section. So it also modifies the verb. Notice that we have 3 arrows going to that verb. Verbs often can have multiple modifiers. Then the final prepositional phrase we have is of a city. Remember I told you that of usually links to the noun before it. So I'm going to check that. I'm going to say what section? The section of a city bus. So this prepositional phrase actually modifies the noun section, which is acting as the object of the preposition in the prepositional phrase before it. Now, I'm looking through here and I know that I have labeled all of my words. I've also identified what words are being modified. The final thing I want to remind you is that modifiers of the verb are movable. That means that I could take these prepositional phrases and things and I could actually move them because they're modifying the word sat. For example, I could say, Mrs. Parks simply sat against the laws of her city in a whites-only section of a city bus. I can move that around. I could also say, in a whites-only section of a city bus, Mrs. Parks simply sat against the laws of her city. I can rearrange those and the meaning is still clear. Now remember, that's only true for adverbs that modify verbs. If an adverb modifies an adjective or another adverb, it is not going to be movable. The next step I'm going to do is diagram the sentence. I'm going to shrink my sentence here. I still want to be able to refer to it, but I do want to be able to diagram. Now, the very first thing I'm going to do is to draw my baseline. I want to make sure that's straight and neat. And then I'm going to put the subject-verb line in the middle. Now, the subject-verb line is going to be straight up and down, and it's going to cross that baseline. And that's because we have a sentence with an action verb. When we get to sentences with other kind of verbs, we'll notice that that changes a little bit. I always diagram left to right, and I always look at the words in the sentence from left to right. So I'm going to diagram the subject first. My subject is Mrs. Parks. Capitalization in a diagram is very important. If it's capitalized in the sentence, it needs to also be capitalized on my diagram. Now I'm going to go to my action verb, sat. Now, I could have other words that we have not learned yet, like a direct object or even an interjection. Right now, we're going to start with diagramming the subject and the verb, and then we have to add any modifiers of the subject and the verb. So I'm going to start, and I'm going to look at that word, Mrs. Parks. If I look back in the sentence, I'm going to notice that I really do not have any modifiers of Mrs. Parks. I don't have any blue arrows being drawn to it. So I'm not going to have any modifiers coming off of that word, Mrs. Parks. Now I'm going to go to the word sat, and I already see 3 arrows. So I know that I'm going to need to do a little bit of planning. I'm going to need to make sure that I'm extra neat. I could even come back over here, and I could even extend this line here to give me a little bit more room. Kind of looking ahead and planning can be helpful. Now, I told you we diagram from left to right, so I'm going to read that sentence. The first modifier of the verb is that prepositional phrase against the laws. So I'm going to diagram just like we learned in Unit 3. I'm going to diagram the prepositional phrase there. Remember that capitalization matters. Against is capitalized in the sentence, so it also needs to be capitalized on my diagram. And I'm also going to come over here and I'm going to diagram the object of the preposition. I like to diagram in pencil because it allows me to do some erasing if I need to and some adjusting. So she sat against what? Against laws. Now again, the rule is that you always diagram modifiers off of the word they modify. The article the is a modifier of laws. So I'm going to draw it off of the word laws. Next, I come to the prepositional phrase of the city. The arrow above it is actually pointing to that object of the preposition laws. Now, it's going to create a funny little diagram here that looks like stair steps. But remember, the simple rule is that you always diagram modifiers off of the word they modify. Because of the city modifies laws, then I'm going to diagram it just like I do other prepositional phrases. Of what? Of city. And then her is a modifier that tells whose city, so I'm going to diagram it off of that word city. Next, I'm going to move to the next modifier, and that word simply. Simply has a blue arrow going to the word sat. I'm going to add it here to my diagram. Simply. Simply is not, it doesn't have any modifiers itself, so I just use this word, I just draw it off of the word sat, and I'm done with that modifier. Finally, I have that prepositional phrase in a whites only section. That is where she sat. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to draw my prepositional phrase just like we've done before. I have the preposition in what? In section. And then this object of the preposition actually has 2 modifiers. It has the object a, and then it has that word whites only. Now again, that whites only is in quotations. That means that it's a direct quote and it's acting as its own unit even though it's 2 words. So I'm going to do whites only. Now I told you earlier that capitalization did matter on a diagram. In punctuation doesn't matter. You don't have to put a period or a question mark or anything like that. But I am going to go ahead and I'm going to put these quotations here because it indicates that this is a quote, and therefore I don't have two separate words with two separate functions. The final modifier I have is that prepositional phrase of a city bus. Again, we always we always diagram off of the word that a modifier is modifying. That arrow is pointing to the object of the preposition section, so I'm going to diagram off of that word. I haven't drawn my line long enough, so I'm going to extend it out. And then I'm going to take that preposition and I'm going to draw it off of it, hoping to have given myself enough room here. This is why we diagram on notebook paper, because it gives us more room. So I have my preposition of, and then I have the word bus. Then I'm going to add my two modifiers. I have a, and I have city. I know those are straight down just because I'm running out of room, but remember that modifiers are always drawn diagonally. If I were to go through and check the points for this diagram, remember you have points for your labeling, but the points for the diagram would work this way. Mrs. Parks would be a point. Sat would be a point. Against the laws, that prepositional phrase is one. Of the city is one. Simply would be a point. In a whites only section would be a point. And then of a city bus. Hopefully this video for how to diagram sentence 3 in Unit 5, Exercise 3, hopefully it's been helpful. Even as you do other sentences, remember that you can come back and learn a lot from watching this video. Have a great day.